Thank you so much for having me, and I'm here to kind of work on rounding out the day for the folks who've been in here for this entire session. And then also, I think part of it too, for those that are just coming in, I think I have enough pieces in there that you get a gist of coccidiosis within the talk itself. So I think part of this is just understanding first what we're going to talk about. And I really want to go through the significance of coccidiosis, the impact, and then part of what my title says is where the alternatives fit and then how they actually work when we think about it in terms of cocci. So first off, I wanted to look at coccidiosis rank. So this one is a bit of a complicated slide. I'll walk you through it. So right on this side, I looked at the percentage, now this is focused to the US specifically, the percentage of the industry that are looking at agristats that are on no antibiotics ever, or in the case of layers specifically, that cage-free program. And then I also looked, if you go to the USA Veterinary Health Association. They also work with veterinarians to look at the rank, how important are different diseases from their perspective based on what it is that they're seeing in the field. And I looked back, and yes, I did look at all of the historical proceedings, so it is very good that they have this out there, and looked at where those ranks fit in terms of when we talk about no antibiotics ever, or we talk about cage-free, because these are a lot of the different pieces when we start seeing rise in coccidiosis. So, and I tried to do my best to color code it because it's pretty complicated. Green being broilers, blue being turkeys, and then purple range being pullets or layers. And then 0 is what didn't even appear in the proceedings, and then 1 is a very high rank, it's important, to 10 plus being low. And essentially what I'm seeing here, which I think is interesting and what we expect, is that broilers in general, it's been a steady high rank, despite, and you would assume it would get even higher as you increase no antibiotics ever production, where you could only use vaccines, now chemicals as well. But it's been a steady high rank even before we started really increasing or ramping up that. In terms of turkeys, it's a steady low rank despite a moderate increase in NAE production. Part of that, I think some of our earlier speakers talked about, you don't have quite the same impact with cocci and turkeys. In pullets and layers, this is where I really thought it was interesting. Pullets specifically, steady high rank regardless of the housing type itself. But with layers, this one I looked at it a little bit deeper. At the beginning when cage-free housing came up, the rank did start to increase, but then it really went back up and it became less important. I think part of that is just as people got more used to it. Now, not just focusing on the US itself, I also wanted to look at kind of where it fits in other parts of the world, and it ranks within top 3 diseases in the UK, top 10 South Asia. I didn't quite get a top number, but it's important in China. Coming from Canada, I know it's something that's always talked about, but I certainly didn't have a number. The other piece is, well, what exactly does coccidiosis cost? So there's a really good paper out in 2020 where they redid that cost estimation looking, this is done by Blake and colleagues, and you look at that global estimation. So they looked at various different countries, the impact looking specifically from broilers, breeders, layers, from pullets to layer production as well, including the cost of morbidity, mortality, and control. And so that number is big. Especially if you think about it in terms of it costs, give or take, about 17 cents US dollars per chicken produced. But what's not taken into consideration is what about the turkey impact, and we're seeing there? What about the cost of dysbiosis that we just learned from our previous speaker? What about necrotic enteritis, the impact of wet litter? And then the other piece is as more and more folks are starting to use additives. So I think this is already a big number, but it's probably something that's higher. So I said I'm here to talk about additives or alternatives, depending on how you think about it. But I think in order to be able to understand where they fit and how they work, we also first have to think about what happens in a healthy gut. So I certainly think in pictures. So here is an example of a healthy gut. You can look at sort of your epithelial cells with those nice little villi intermixed with goblet cells and M cells. And essentially what we have is it's acting as a good barrier. You're getting even digestive flow, a balanced and diverse microflora, which is ultimately what you want to be able to support the health of that intestine, so it can act to help absorb those nutrients, but also function as a protective barrier. And I always like looking at pictures to be able to visualize it a bit better. So normally we see pictures of villi. This one is actually in turkeys, but they've kind of taken all of the microbiota off. But that's not really what the gut looks like. So this one, I really could only find it in mice. But this is probably more of sort of what an intestine starts looking like with all of those bacteria that's coming on. And this truly even doesn't represent every possible microbiota that could be there. So when we think about the impact that Eimeria or coccidiosis in general has, what are kind of those basic pieces that it has in terms of its impact? The first is it initiates gut damage. Then this gut damage is ultimately going to impact nutrient digestibility. It's going to start going down. Then there's going to be an interaction with bacteria, and I'll get into that over my next little bit. And then also interact with the host immune system. So if you were here in the earlier talks, we certainly had this from some of our previous speakers between all of these different pieces. So if I think about the progression of coccidial infection, how am I starting to think about it? So again, we kind of come back to that picture of the intestinal lining. I tried having sort of a guide to help you through how I think about these things. And first, we have the Eimeria that's entering the cell and it's replicating. So it's coming in and it's causing some sort of disturbance as it's entering the cell. It's going to leave some proteins behind that's going to start creating the inflammation. Then it has to exit the cell to kind of reinfect and continue in that replication. As it's exiting the cell, it's also creating more inflammation. And again, I need to think about how it just physically looks. So I started looking at some other pictures here. And we have to think about Eimeria, whether it's the sporozoite, merozoite, anything that's coming out or exiting, is physically leaving a hole. And we've seen these pictures. So you can start thinking of it as these little mini explosions. And Eimeria or coccidiosis is a numbers game. The more severe the disease, the more parasites that are there, so the more explosions that you have. And that's where you start running into these challenges. But as it's exiting, it's creating it's interacting with other things in the intestinal tract. So you have the cell death. The cell is reacting to that exit. Kind of put here, some of them will exit into the lamina propria. Some of them will exit kind of into the mucin area. And this is ultimately going to weaken that mucosis. You'll get an increase in mucinogenesis. And then this is going to be what changes the environment. So we can have that immediate change, but to our previous speaker, I do truly believe it's that long-term change that is what's happening and why we see some of these differences. So kind of going back of how we got to alternatives or just different products being used in the first place. Greg had this in one of his slides, and I tried putting this in terms of a table. But you can kind of look at the decades of anticoccidial drug released. This one is, I could find some numbers for USA and global. And I kind of put about, because I did my best to count, but I could have missed a couple in there. And then at the same time within that decade, when anticoccidial drug resistance was first described, and then kind of relating this back to vaccine release, and then what we start seeing in terms of industry trends. So you see, just as Greg was talking about, there's a time when you really had your heyday or the golden age, if you will, of these anticoccidial drugs being released. But then with time, pressure, money required, it starts decreasing and decreasing, but you're seeing at the same time sort of that resistance being described as well with use, overuse, and not, even though we do have responsible rotation and shuttle, you still continue to see it because there's only a few being able to be used. And then at the same time, kind of aligning with these bans in terms of antibiotic growth promoters, talking about ionophores, whether they're an antibiotic or an anticoccidial, and you start seeing an increase as well of vaccines being released. Not to forget, those couple that were released early with early strains. So the piece that people start getting confused is, well, there is quite a difference between when you talk about anticoccidial versus alternatives. And I think about it, it's almost as if we're thinking about it in terms of, the anticoccidials are very defined. There's few of them. There's process for creating. So this is almost like your soft, hard, or fried egg station. You know what you're going to get every single time because that's what you're expecting. There's a way of it being produced. There can be little differences if you're talking about omega-3 eggs versus vitamin D, but ultimately an egg is an egg. When we talk about alternatives, this is what I'm calling the make your own omelet station. It's still eggs, but at the end of the day, there's quite a lot of variety and potential for variation. So this is really where you're going to get a lot of your different broad categories, and this is by no means all of them. And then within each of that, there's going to be a difference in each category for your selection criteria, growing conditions, processing, bioactives, mixtures. I could continue to go on. So there really is a lot of this variety. So you're not kind of comparing the same thing necessarily. It's just different ways of doing it. But like anything, when we talk about either even just an anticoccidial program or more specifically the additive or alternative programs, it's certainly something that has to be start to finish. There's no silver bullet with all of that variety, and it truly is a combination. I kind of think of it in terms of the 80-20 rule, if you will. You're going to have 80% of it relate back to feed management, water management, and management. I called it farm, house, or shed, depending on where in the world you're from. And then that 20% is going to be the additive program. So if you're thinking that this is going to be your fix for absolutely everything, you also have to look at other pieces that are happening at the same time. They don't happen, they're not mutually exclusive. They certainly overlap. So one of the things is the questions for selecting an additive program and how that suits your particular business and what it is that you're doing. I always kind of go back to what is the goal, what are you trying to achieve, and then what's the challenge you're seeing. If the initial challenge is, okay, I'm seeing a result of some sort of secondary bacterial infection, you have to start going, well, why? What's starting it in the first place? Maybe it's a mycotoxin issue. Maybe it is cocci. It's getting being a bird detective, if you will, which I think is something that we all are. And then from that, other things looking at, well, what can I fix or improve? How do these things work? And then ultimately picking what I should use. So if we relate this back, again, going back to US, specifically broiler programs, because this is where I could find the most numbers, what I tried doing is looking at these different programs and relating it back to percent spend, especially if we talk about it in terms of anticoccidials and alternatives. I couldn't do it for vaccines, just not in the same like on a per ton basis. So here what I did is I have my percentage of USA complexes in these different programs that we have here. This I looked at percent spend over average feed cost. This really is going to range depending on whether it's expensive feed or less expensive feed. That's going to impact your percentage. And then this one I realized afterwards, this is actually the percent breakdown is based on the total gut health cost, or gut health spend, sorry, as opposed to feed costs. So these numbers do look a lot higher, but that's why. So I think what's quite interesting here is when we look at the no antibiotics ever, they're mostly going to be using vaccines as well as chemicals, or the no, I put that backwards, no antibiotics important for human medicine. The sort of percent spend when you look at medications versus gut health is give or take similar, but there's a little bit of a difference when you look at the range overall between sort of lowest spend versus highest spend. Now, granted, this would be specific for kind of that preventative chemical ionophore. I don't believe it takes into consideration treatment. And there might be variation just because someone could be dealing with more challenging issues. Now, if we kind of relate this back, I think what's interesting in the no antibiotics ever, this one, they're kind of spreading out their spend based on sort of phytogenics, organic acids, and pre and probiotics. And I think this is different uses depending on what it is that they're trying to do. And I'll get into that over the next couple of slides. Versus we look at the ones where they're using ionophores, which can deal with cocci as well as a little bit in terms of the antibiotics. And then they're focusing much more, they're saying, okay, I'm thinking it is you're dealing much more with the cocci, and how do we deal more so with that bacteria or the bacteria mix? And then in the conventional, not to say that there is no spend in the conventional, but kind of moving, again, the cocci is managed. How do we deal with the other piece in terms of that bacterial diversity that's there? So now we have to start looking at how these alternatives work in terms of the parasite itself. So first, we have, I'm calling it, is more of the direct action. This would be usually related to various phytogenics and metabolites. Very good if you're looking for more of the specifics, a literature review done by these folks down here. So the first one would be the impact on the oocyst prior to shedding, and then impact on the sporozoite, schizoid, merozoite, those external phases. And depending on sort of what it is that you're using, there's been some reported relating to inhibiting enzymes that support sporulation, changing the morphology, or having an impact on that oocyst. In terms of the sort of other external stages, are there ways of decreasing the invasion, either by breaking down intracellular proteins or decreasing the adherence to the cell so it's more challenging to get in, or impacting the wall formation? And then other pieces is also, how do you have stress on the actual cell itself, either by disturbing the lipid membrane, impacting the permeability, or stress inside the cell itself based on increasing the reactive oxygen species so that parasite is more stressed, or destroying the cytoplasm. Much more of that direct action. But then there's also the other piece, which is the impact on the host during the infection. So antioxidant components, immune modulation, impact on the bacteria, or the other pieces that are happening, and in some cases maintaining the water within the intestinal cell so that you can get less water or wet litter. But again, with all of these pieces, you could look at various different ones, various different alternatives, and the species impacted, the mode of action, really is dependent on the raw material, production, how it's produced, the process, bioactives, and the mix. So here are just some examples of what could be done. The other piece is feeding for defense against coccidiosis. So kind of going with the idea that a subclinical or clinical challenged bird is going, because of all of those little mini explosions, it's going to have a challenge to be able to absorb different nutrients. So another strategy could be, if it's going to have challenge to absorb nutrients, then possibly this bird is going to be deficient in certain amino acids. So there's been a variety of amino acid mixes that have been thought, kind of as it relates to the gastrointestinal tract, to be able to kind of adjust for these potential deficiencies. Then you also have enzymes. How do we make it easier for the bird to be able to absorb the nutrients? So that's where these have been used. So easier for the bird to be able to absorb the nutrients, and more challenging for the bacteria to be able to take advantage of those nutrients sort of free within the intestine. And then last but not least, in terms of feeding, would be looking at minerals and vitamins to be able to support the host immune response, but then having them in higher bioavailable forms, so it's more, again, easy for that chicken or turkey to be able to absorb those nutrients. And then there's the last piece here, which is the indirect action of the alternatives. So this is impacting that host during infection. This is kind of what I'm calling supporting for production during infection. So you have gut irritation. We just previously talked about mycotoxins potentially as a leading for necrotic enteritis. So if we're able to decrease gut irritation with things like mycotoxin binders, but also work on other pieces in terms of intestinal integrity and maintaining that intestinal environment condition. Again, depending on sort of what is happening, there can be different alternatives in these areas. Another one would be immune modulation, so supporting for helping to decrease the oocysts being shed and decreasing that lesion severity. And then the last part would be the impact on the microflora. So less so directly on the parasite itself per se, although there is some work that's suggesting, okay, maybe this helps to decrease attachment sites for that external parasite to be able to come into the cell. But more so, I think, is the decreasing the secondary infection. So when we think about the microbiota in general, it's not just the total number of bacteria, but it's also, remember, we have to look at who is there and what are they doing. So that diversity is really important because we want a mix of our beneficial bacteria, there's going to be opportunistic ones, and then always those pathogenic ones. So how can we kind of outcompete some of the ones that could be more of a challenge? So there's different ones in here. We think about some, for example, manna-enriched fraction, helping for selective removal of certain bacteria like E. coli, salmonellas, and allowing the space, if you will, for more beneficial bacteria or that diversity that's there. And then others that may have more of an antibacterial component and some diversity-related research as well. So one of the pieces is being able to take advantage of the synergies of these different alternatives that can be put together. So this is just one example. So this was done back in 2014 with cob birds, and there's different combinations that are here. When I put combo 1, that's a mix of plant extracts, essential oils, yeast carbohydrates, and organic minerals. And I think what's interesting in here is if we look at the shed on oocysts per gram of feces, the top being these were all cocci-vaccinated birds. Yes, we end up with the higher level of shed, which is to be expected because that's what you're getting with the vaccines. But you can start looking at seleniomycin, which is T5 along here. You kind of use that in terms of a bio-shuttle, but these other programs can also work in a bio-shuttle way as well. So you're still able to have that cycling, but it helps to take the edge off during the time when you can run into potentially a little bit more of a necrotic enteritis or a higher stress risk. Then the other piece is kind of relating this back in terms of lesions, and what we're seeing in here for all of the different groups, we're getting similar low lesions and suggesting that we are able to get protection. The protection for cocci was able to occur. And then in terms of what we're seeing as it relates back to feed conversion, what I think is most important here is that the group that happened to have the alternatives in there, not just to sort of mix and manage different aspects of coccidiosis infection, but ones that were helping with the microbial diversity in the start as well as the end of production. That's where we started seeing the best benefit kind of in line with what we were seeing with seleniomycin in terms of weight gain and adjusted feed conversion. So that's kind of all of those different pieces, but I like to think of how we put all of this together. And standing up here as a Canadian, we can relate anything to hockey, but I figured in this case, I have to kind of relate it back to football. So I brushed off my inner Taylor Swift fan during the Super Bowl and looked in Chat GPT, figured out football, and I started thinking about this in terms of the gut. So one side, I have the lumen of the gut, the other side, I have the inside of the intestine, and then we can think of one team is Team Imeria in terms of the aim is to invade the cells, and then the other side is the team host, and you're really wanting to prevent invasion. So there's a couple of different ways of dealing with this. We can think of my offensive strategy, my offensive formation, my immunity sieve, whether I'm looking at antibodies, peptide and protein secretions, my offensive strength, the immune response, the intracellular immune response, how that host is reacting to the Imeria cells. But then there's also the special team strategy, I like to believe, in terms of those quick wins. How can we work on inhibiting sporulation, impacting the invasion? But then there's also the other side, is I need something that's a little bit more defensive. So in this way, the host is kind of working on defense to continue to prevent that invasion. So the defensive strategy really is impacting the impact of microflora. So I really am looking at, in terms of my, again, not just the total number, but who is there and what are they doing. So diversity of players and their roles. This is something that's certainly going to be dynamic, and this is where various alternatives can fit in here. The other side is my defensive mindset. How am I supporting these players? The antioxidants, the enzymes, amino acids support the cells during stress, support the ease of nutrient absorption, and then I need to be able to be flexible, so maintaining that intestinal integrity, support the cellular repair. But in any football game, there's also other conditions that can have an impact as well. So if it's a muddy field, think about it in terms of your mucus level. If I'm increasing the mucus level, which is what happens with Imeria, this potentially could change the type of mucus. It's not always a defensive advantage. Sometimes this can run you into challenges. You think of something like necrotic enteritis. But then there's always the other piece. I kind of call it the referee calls, the ones that you get so mad about because you can't change. These are going to be your external stressors or your other factors. But like anything, how do we actually win the game? And we don't always win it every single time, but we do our best. And it's more than just the plays. The players, the player combination, how these strategies are used, external conditions, and then ultimately your goal on how you're going to win the game really ends up mattering. And like anything, teamwork really can make a difference. And this is an important piece, to have all of these different players that help to manage, to be able to interact and work together well, so that you can know what's happening and then how things could be changed. So with that, I will say thank you very much, and I really appreciate you staying here till the bitter end.